macro basically replaces your RCT export model string by these 3 lines. But there is an issue in this code. Actually, we call RCT register model with a self. It's a function, right? But we don't define this function in our model. And every single time when we compile a model, it looks only on itself. So it's like, if the function is not defined, our compiler will complain about that, right? So we have a workaround for that. We can use RCT extern, which is just a fancy replacement of extern C, which basically tells the compiler that, you know, bro, we have this model, but it's this function, but it's defined somewhere outside of this file. So after compilation, there will be a linkage stage, and linker will find all these dangling pointers and wire them all together. So basically, that's a way how to avoid compiler to complain about that. I hope this part is more or less clear. Because next we go to the definition of the RCT register model. Because, well, we call this function, we need to know what it does. And basically, this function, the only responsibility of this function is to check if the model can be exported, if it conforms to the protocol that React Native enforces native models to implement. So if it conforms to protocol, then it's just about adding this class to the array. So we have an array called RCT model classes, and we just put this model into this array. You're probably wondering why the heck we need it. But the point is that if you integrating, for instance, your React Native application with an existing application, let's say you have, I don't know, 10,000 classes in your code. And of course, it's really not performant to iterate over all these classes and export all these classes. Even taking into account that you probably don't mind doing this, it's just unperformant. So what we do by this macro, we're saying like, OK, take this class and export it to JavaScript, but nothing else. So unless you specify this macro, this class wouldn't be visible for the bridge. So that's about this file, more or less, this macro, more or less. And the second macro, RCT export method, RCT export method. And this time it takes only one argument, but it's mandatory to specify it. It's a method that you want to export. Of course, sometimes you don't want to export all the methods from the model. You want to pick some that you really want to use from JavaScript and export only them. So basically, we're trying to pick exactly the same, the exact pieces of code that we want to export and export only them and nothing else. This macro is a bit more complex in the sense that it calls different macros. And you know, there is a huge chain of this that results with something like that. It's like, it's unreadable, guys. I mean, I don't know what about you, but for me, that looks like a pure magic, at least first time it was. So it registers a class method called __RCT export __120, which doesn't make any sense, and it returns an array of empty string and a method signature. That's, I don't know, at least it's strange. So it's strange unless you start to think of it in the scope of the runtime. I will elaborate what I mean, but first of all, let me determine what I mean under the runtime. Runtime is a program lifecycle phase, which represents the time during which program is executed. So basically, you start your program, and after everything is loaded, runtime starts. And all these macros that I explained before, they're processed by the preprocessor. So before the compilation step, there is one extra step called preprocessing. So it processes all these macros, replaces the code by the one I shown you, and only after that, application loads, and you hit in runtime. So by this moment of time, you already have everything replaced, and your RCT models are defined, and your methods are exported, and everything in its proper places. So at runtime, what we have in React Native, first of all, we initialize RCT root view where our React Native application lives. RCT root view requires a bridge. So it basically creates a simple bridge, and then this bridge creates bashed bridge. And I know there is a kind of level of confusion around that because it's, I don't know, probably it's not the best naming for that. But the point is that first bridge, RCT bridge, is just a pure shell. So it's just a container that spawns RCT bashed bridge. You're probably wondering, why do we need that? Well, if you ever developed React Native application, then you know that in React Native you have this fancy menu that you can access by shaking. And you can reload your bundle, for instance. And if you're reloading your bundle, you're also reloading a bridge. So you have this RCT bridge that manages all this respawning of the child RCT bashed bridge. And well, more or less the same works for hot model replacement and other stuff. I mean, when you enable or disable these features. So at the moment when RCT bashed bridge has been initialized, it starts to initialize other models. So it basically iterates over all these models that we started to expose on our load time by this macro says. So it basically takes this array, iterate over this array, takes the model names that we specified or not specified. If the model name is not specified in the first macro, which is RCT export model, sorry, I think it's really confusing, but still, if you didn't specify any name there, that will take just a class name as usual. So once it iterates over these models, it wraps them in the special RCT model data structure. And the structure stands for containing some additional technical information that React Native has to know to properly use your models. It's a link to the bridge, it's some other Boolean flags. So just you need to know why, basically. And then once model data is created, it also stored to some array. And later on, you will understand why. So once this part is done, and we wrapped all our models to the model data and stored it to arrays, we need to configure these models. And what we do for that, well, if you remember, the result of RCT export model was an array with 2 strings in it. So here it is. It was the first one was empty, the second one was about the signature of the method that we want to export. So if you take a look on the implementation, it basically iterates over these models that we exported, checks all its methods, and if method starts with RCT export, this weird thing, then it basically invokes this method and take this array that it returns. So once again, go back, take a look on this array. So first one is a JavaScript name, and the second one is a signature. So it takes it. I'm not sure if I can do that. Yeah, I can do that. So this one, entries 1, is the signature of the method. And the second one is a method name. And we create a model method. It's another wrapper. It sounds strange, but we wrap all the things. That's the way React Native works. Once it's done, it also goes to a special array of model methods. So everything is exported. Now, once everything is configured, exported, processed, and everything, we have to run our JavaScript executor. So JavaScript executor is basically our context where we run JavaScript. And it looks like this, but it's, we have RCT JavaScript context that requires GSC context that can be accessed by GSC wrapper. So something like this, And once everything is configured, you finally have your JavaScript context methods and create this configuration. So now our context Our JavaScript context knows about all the native models we have in its system. It knows everything. It knows methods. It knows signatures. It knows literally everything, even the constants if they export them. And then we just say that JavaScript executor, hey, inject this JSON text and register it as a FB-based bridge config. And that sounds mystical, but let's take a look on the same thing from the JavaScript side. That's a native models file. So it's a libraries-based bridge, native models inside React Native repo. As I said, we have a global variable called FB-based bridge config, and it's assigned to the global context. So it can be accessed as any global variable, basically. So we have this array of configuration for the models. We iterate over it, generate a JavaScript model that can be invoked from the JavaScript, basically, and register it at the native models. So right here. So once again, we have this exported from the native side through the context of the JavaScript. We iterate over this configuration. We generate invocable models from that. It's a really huge piece of code, so I decided not to include it in this presentation. Otherwise, it's complete mind blown. So basically, if we can generate the model, and model is there, we register this model, and that's it. So once that's done, we can just load and execute our code. So we load the bundle and physically transport it to the JavaScript context and ask it to run it. And that's it. That's the way how it works, without some really extra complexity stuff about trading, about optimizations, loggers, and all the things that React Native does for you. So if you want to know more, you can take a look at my articles on medium.com. I try to explain all the things about JavaScript context and depths and the way it works. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Alexei, we'll have a few minutes for Q&A. So.
Oh yeah. I was too quick. Sorry, guys.
So if somebody have questions, just raise your hand and shout out the questions. Alexei will definitely ask them.
I was too happy to run away.
So that sounds like a really good walkthrough of all the steps. How much do you have to do as a developer to make a native module?
Well, as a developer, you can just, it's pretty much enough to.
6 months ago, I'd say it's 9 months ago now, we were selecting a solution for navigating and routing in our apps. And we sort of ran into a maze of options. And that maze of options is what I'm briefly going to go through today. And I'm going to tell you at the end that there is a solution very nearly in sight to really skip all of that maze and go straight to a single canonical way of navigating, not only in React Native, but also in React on web. So, as I said, my name is Bartel Caruza. I run a small company, startup called Imidi. Here's an embarrassing picture from yesterday. After the big pitch we did at the end of the accelerator program of Startup Bootcamp. So I did a 5-minute pitch in front of 400 investors, which is a lot less fun than doing this. So I'm glad I'm back to doing something with tech. We make React Native apps. We have a white label product that we sell to B2B sales and marketing organization. So because we have white label apps that we make a lot of, we have more apps in production than Facebook. Of course, they're a lot less complicated, but I think that's still always something I like to say to people. So the topic is the navigator confusion that I went through, and I think a lot of React Native developers have experienced what is going on with navigators. Here's a Twitter question from September last year, like, hey, it's still not ideal, what's going on, who's using what today? React Native Router Flux, React Native Router, X navigation, own abstraction. Own abstraction is actually the one we decided to go for at the time, which was a great learning experience to sort of see how that works and how to do that well with animations and screens popping in and replacing each other. Yeah, so one of the options on the screen I'm going to tell a little bit more about, which is X navigation, is becoming one that's quite dominant. So where do you start? You're a React Native developer. I'm just going to start with a question. Who has mostly come from a web development background here? Okay. How many native developers do we have? Okay. How many of those are iOS? Almost all. Okay. How many of those are Android? Proud of you guys. Good. So, as I said, my background is Android, and navigation in mobile apps, especially Android apps, works in one of two ways. You use intents to move from activity to activity, which are complete apps, basically, or you do something with fragments, which you can use to make it easier to make a multi-screen app. So parts of screen you can reuse in other parts of the application. Neither of those solutions are really perfect, and navigation is kind of a hard problem that's not really solved that well, I think, in Android. In iOS, there is, I think, more contentment of what you can do with navigation, with navigation controllers. It seems to work pretty well from what I'm hearing. But on React Native, who knows this movie, by the way? It's a 1986 sci-fi movie by Disney. It's called Flight of the Navigator. Yeah. So it's about a boy who discovers a spaceship which is called a navigator. Some trivia. So you start your journey into the navigators with a documentation page, which is very current, React Native 0.40, and it tells you this is where you're going to learn how to do navigation in React Native. And we start with, if you're just starting out with navigation, you're just doing your first navigation around, you start with Navigator. That's the old implementation. And if you're doing iOS only, you go to Navigator iOS. If you're feeling brave, you cannot go wrong with Navigation Experimental as the next step. Okay, so it seems like a pretty straightforward thing, but usually you have one in your app, so you have to make a choice here. I'm going to start first with the Navigator. Navigator was the original implementation of navigation in React Native. It was quite a complete solution, had some problems that you couldn't really compose apps into each other, which was something we kind of want to do with mobile apps. And a big downside is animations are done the old React Native way, pre-animated, so they are slow. They're not good enough to say this is the solution to work with, because your apps feel a little bit slow when they go from screen to screen, because all the animation work in Navigator is being done on the JavaScript thread, which is for many reasons not a very good solution. Also, it doesn't look exactly like the iOS platform standard Navigator, which was, I think, the reasoning behind Navigator iOS, which is using the native modules way of wrapping certain components of iOS to make them available as sort of a subset of navigation. Here you would have a status bar that looks perfect on iOS. Downside is no cross-platform, 0, which is kind of silly if you're making a React Native app. But also an option that said this could be one of the options. 2 options here, we're not done yet, because we have a third option that is also not the option, because of the third option is navigation experimental. Eric Vicente came up with a very good solution for navigation, or at least it was a very good idea of a solution for navigation called navigation experimental, which should tell most people it is experimental. We should not do that right now unless we are trying things out. But the main part under this, under the hood, it's using the animated API, so it's using an animation framework that works a lot better and makes animation smooth, so the transitions between your screens are very smooth, and it really starts to look like a full-on native app. The downside of navigation experimental is that the API is a little bit harder to understand. It exposes a lot of internals, and you have to work through a few things before you have it up and running. But this was a very good starting point, and this was the starting point I used around 9 months ago, and then ran into some issues with something I couldn't get working, so I rewrote parts of this library. This library is very lightweight. It's basically you take two screens, and you animate them as a stack over each other. But I'm not going to bore you with that because the API is not something we're going to use anymore. Here's an explanation of why it was necessary, but a next step is the evolution of it. And this line in the current documentation, you can't go wrong with navigation experimental, is not quite true anymore. So watch out for that. Another line of reasoning came up, X-Navigator, a more complete solution. This one is from the guys at Exponent. They said the navigation options we have in React Native are not good enough because you need to have more route-based navigation, because we web developers know how to do route-based navigation. It's more familiar for people to do it that way. Okay, so X-Navigator came up as an abstraction layer on top of the original Navigator. Again, had the same downfalls. Navigation or animations are slow. Another evolution from that, X-Navigation. If you can see the difference here, one is called X-Navigator. Route-centric navigation built on top of React Native's Navigator. The evolution of that is downwards, X-Navigation, and this piece is gone. So there's an improvement going on here. But actually, this is not a bad place to be. The guys at Exponent made this library, which is a really good library. It is actually batteries included, which means it's a lot more full-featured. You can do things like deep linking with it, which is essential for apps. It's very easy to make deep linking work, and route-based sort of configuration file of these are my routes with the various components that belong to that. Side note, X-Navigation 2 will be called React Navigation, and that's the one that I'm actually going to talk about. So we're almost at the end of this journey. React Navigation is going to be the one we're going to be all using into the future, also in the react.js organization. Sort of canonical way to do navigation. And it's a evolution of X-Navigation with navigation experimental. People that were working on these two things are going to fully collaborate and make the solution. Learn once, navigate everywhere. So the promise of React Navigation goes one step further. You can also use this for navigation on web. And on this website, the documentation website for React Navigation, they actually implemented React Navigation to navigate on that particular website. So it's not only React Native, which is a great step forward. We'll have one way to do routing and navigation in all of the React ecosystem. And also, one of the things I mentioned earlier that we couldn't do with Navigator, the original one, is compose different sort of sub-apps into each other. So basically, in an ideal state, you want to be able to install a checkout flow for payments into your app and have that pretty much ready-made, a whole flow of a section of an app that you don't want to be building over and over again, as we are doing right now, because it's very hard to compose apps into each other. So that's something that is really solved in React Navigation. It comes in two pre-made Navigator options. One is the Stack Navigator, and the other one is the Tabs Navigator. It comes from mobile apps, have different patterns than web in a lot of cases. On iOS apps, you have the default pattern of having tabs below, so you can navigate to different sections of an app. You press on a button, settings or profile, or I'm going to show that in the app a little bit later. And the stack one is basically you have a screen that you're loading is loaded on top of the next screen, and it's loaded on top of the next screen and the next one, and you can go back through that stack. And this is two types of navigators that are implemented on top of React Navigation that are default. But you can make your own. You can go pretty deep into how to make this. Downside of React Navigation is it was planned to be released this week, but it wasn't. So right now it still lives as a private repository, and and you can't access it yet, but I think it should be soon. It's looking pretty stable. Looking at the graphs, a massive amount of work has been put into it over December and early January. I'm really hoping that soon we'll release this, and this talk will also make more sense because then it's a solution you can actually use. Yeah, and so as I said, also the main guy behind this is Eric Vicenti. Okay, this is another part of Flight of the Navigator. Really good movie, by the way. I can recommend it. All of this was spurred on by his talk at React Europe last year, where he basically laid out the vision of we should have a navigation solution that makes it very easy for us to have composable apps and also a unidirectional flow of navigation actions and state, sort of Redux-like way of dealing with navigation, instead of having an app cross-wired entirely to make navigation work. Yeah, so basically what goes into a navigator is a particular component inside React Navigation. A navigator is a component that has a router. And the router is the one that makes it possible to have the actions outside of the actual navigation. So it has a router, a navigator, and with a navigator I mean a component like the tabs navigator, for example. Tabs navigator has a router, tabs router. And basically inside one navigator you can have multiple navigators and tied together with the same routers. So here's a first example of how this actually looks. How you set up your routes. You pass it an object with several route options, and these link to components, which is pretty simple. But also they can link to, instead of a screen, which is a component, they can link to a other navigator. So you can nest tab, which has a lot of screens that stack onto each other inside one of the tabs, or the other way around. So you get basically a flow like this. And actions are passed to the lowest router that says, I can't handle this, I'm already on my last page. And then they go up one layer and up until they get to the top. Also, it's possible to tie React Navigation into Redux. Pretty straightforward way, so you can use all of the Redux dev tools if you're using that to basically see your navigation state pass by, or to be able to manipulate your navigation state. Because it's all unidirectional data flow, this just adds a little bit of capability that you would have with your other Redux tooling. And this is pretty much all you have to do to tie it into Redux. Right, so what I'm going to show you now is, I think that can be a bit bigger, but not really. How about this? Yeah, okay. So these are various different types of layouts that they have implemented as examples in the React Navigation library. Things like a drawer layout, which has tabbing on it, or stacks of screens. And the library comes with the animations you would have for basically moving your screen up and down. And this is something that's pretty simple to implement in animated, because the progress from here to here is something you can just set easily, and then every other animation moves with you, such as the top bar. But it's nice that you get out of the box the platform standard navigations, the animations. Basically what the library solves versus rolling your own on navigation is that you would have to make an animation that has to look good on iOS in the iOS context, and a similar animation looks good on Android, but a different animation because it's a different platform that you're on. The library takes care of that if you stay within the sort of defaults. And if you don't want to sort of differentiate your app on the way screens move from one another, it's a pretty good option to just turn on the defaults. You get some nice animations straight out of the box. And there's quite a bit of tweaking involved in making these really spot-on perfect compared to the native apps, because this is not using the native elements under it, the native views and the native animations. It's really re-implementing the way they look on iOS and re-implementing the way they look on Android. So a lot of effort goes into that, and that's sort of taken care of for you. The React navigation library comes with basically a set of examples that show you how things look like on code level. Yes. Yeah. Right. Let me see. I think I have to actually change the font in WebStorm to do this. Oh, this is bigger. Yes. I love buttons that sort of solve the whole problem in one go. Okay. So basically what we're seeing here is a function that's creating a component. It's getting a property called navigation. It's the one that's getting passed down to the components where you want to do actions such as navigate to a particular route, passing properties. So the route can have more properties passed to it than just the route name. So you open the profile page with name set to Jordan in this case. What we see here is basically a list of buttons, which each button navigating to a different route. What is more interesting to see is how the configuration looks like. We see here is the stack navigator is called, creating the settings tab, navigator. This is a navigator object coming out of it. We can set some things here, such as the path. Now you see here path, which is more of a web context, which is not necessarily something you would need for a mobile app, but it becomes useful in the case of wanting out-of-the-box deep linking throughout your app. Which is something that, if you were working only on native code, is a little bit trickier to implement. But using this navigation library, it's much easier to do deep linking across your app because you can have your URL specified, even though the screens don't necessarily need URLs. Yeah, and it comes with extra options that also can be overridden on component level. So one of the features that's interesting to see, you want to co-locate some of these settings into the components themselves. For example, my home screen would want to specify some navigation options that you don't want in the global configuration, but you want especially there where your component is. Just like we want to co-locate our CSS, we want to co-locate as much as possible into that component itself. And you do that, let me see if I can get an example for that one. Okay, well, I'll look up the example for this one later. Sorry, I forgot the file name that I was looking for. Yeah. Okay. Well, this is basically the repository React navigation with a examples folder that has a little bit of everything to try things out. One thing to note is the repository itself is missing quite a bit still when it comes to documentation. So that's also mainly the reason why it's not out there yet. Sometimes you will see things like coming soon and to do. They're working really hard on getting that complete. And it's also quite a mammoth task to want to consolidate all of the navigation craziness that has been going on in the past year. But yeah, so here's another interesting section, is that they're working on a complete web integration, so you can use navigation also in your web apps like this. And deep linking, which is also, I think, a very interesting feature for mobile developers. Let me take us back to the presentation for a second. Yeah, so Basically, in short, planned to be released this week, but most likely it's going to be in the coming weeks. React Navigation, or the npm install save React Navigation, is going to be the only navigation library we're going to need from now on. That's going to save us a lot of time, mostly because the promise of React Navigation is a little bit bigger than, hey, I have to look for a navigation library and now I can quickly find it. The promise is that because everyone will use the same navigation library, there will be a sort of ecosystem of libraries that offer complete app flows. And these complete app flows that we can include into our apps, all of them will be dependent on, hey, you're using React Navigation, you can just plug it in, you can throw it into your apps, and have it as a complete set there. One example of that is, for example, like a chat app that you want to include into your app to have a chat screen going on there. Or payment service providers will provide a really rich plugin that takes care of a very, very polished, native, animated flow that is complete with everything that you can just include into your app if navigation is working. Okay, and that's it. And concluding, thank you. Okay, yeah, so here comes a name object coming through. There's no banner at this level, but here you see the name being passed as a property on the configuration. Yeah.
I see. Okay, and the second question, do you use animated for the transitions and everything that you have? I mean, the animation,
Yes, it's animated based. Yeah, so basically React Navigation under the hood is a evolution of navigation experimental. Yeah, with a clean API and with full
Alex?
No, it's also a bot. One more time. The third one definitely going to be okay. Chad Smith. Yeah, we tried exactly to appeal to all bots around, but then
Keep going until the Twitter handle looks normal.
yeah, it's exactly machine learning. We are going to learn machines to React Native.
Chad Smith.
Okay. To be honest, it's the first time we ever do a raffle based on Twitter, and we were not aware that there are so many of them. I don't trust this guy. He's also. Yeah, Sammy. Oh yeah, but it was before we actually started. I just tried it to test it. Yeah, correct. Amazing people. Yeah. What should we do? Do we have? Yeah. Let me check. Okay.
Do you still have normal people on Twitter?
That was hard.
Except me, of course. Even I have one. Because sometimes the shit on my Twitter. Да найди ты просто кого-нибудь уже в этом списке.
Okay.
Don't be put the fingers in the name. This guy.
Yeah. Let me guess a number from the list. 23.
Bot from Meetup.com. 23.
1, 2, 3, 4. I should be less. 8, 9, 10, 11.
16, 17, 18, 19,
Definitely not
22, 20.
Gilgamesh. I hear.
Sounds the same as Twitter.
Go for the next one. Next one. Okay, next one. Yeah, let's just proceed for the next one. Fabian?
Yeah, I'm here.
Finally! You won!
I never thought, to be honest, that this kind of machines exist. So how's